I call this the Lunar era because its beliefs and mythology were ruled by the close observation of the moon. This era lasted from around 50,000 BCE until the inception of Christianity, although it's very difficult at this distance to be precise. So there are three great mysteries that have always drawn our attention. First of all, the mystery of the starry cosmos that we can see at night. Secondly, the mystery of nature that is all around us. And thirdly, the mystery of our consciousness and its relationship with the eternal ground. And the primary question of the lunar era was, how do we act so as to be in harmony with nature and the cosmos? Our evolutionary journey over some 13 billion years has taken us into a process of evolution out of the actual elements of the stars that we came from originally, out of the slow evolution of life on this planet, and out of our long experience as humans on this planet. So what evolutionary intention has driven our emergence from cosmic and planetary life? Why do we find ourselves here on this planet? And how can we attune our consciousness to this evolutionary intention and to the innate harmony of the cosmos as people did in the past? From as long ago as 50,000 BCE, the Great Mother was an image that connected the tiny human self to the environment in which it was embedded. The tiny self was, so to speak, contained within the womb of the cosmic and earth mother, just as an embryo is contained within the body of its mother during the gestation period. The consciousness at this time was largely instinctive, what the philosopher Owen Barfield called original participation. It was a totally different way of perceiving and relating to life than the one we have now. We lived within the life of the Great Mother, who was the earth and the cosmos. There was no clear differentiation between ourselves and the life that surrounded us. Everything was related, everything had meaning, and everything was alive with spirit. This experience still survives in certain indigenous cultures today, and it gave rise to the feeling of kinship with all creation. There was no sense of a separate conscious mind or ego such as we have today, but a strong sense of relationship with nature and the cosmos. The survival of the clan or tribe was what mattered most, not the survival of the individual. Through our instincts and what I call our lunar soul, we were connected to the soul of the earth and the soul of the cosmos. In those primordial instincts were carried the collective memories and primordial habits of the human, animal, and plant species. Tools and highly developed skills, such as astronomy, developed out of that sense of connection and relationship, and above all, observation. They were far more skilled at observation than we are today. By the way, you don't need to take notes because you will have the text of this talk, so don't worry about that. Now I would like to turn to specific images of the Great Mother associated with this ancient time and follow them through different cultures. Here are three images of her. The central one is the oldest and has been recently discovered in Germany, dated to around 40,000 BC. The others were found in the Dordogne area of France and date to around 25,000 BC. At that time, there was tremendous emphasis on the fertility of women and animals, since our survival was dependent on this. And I am sure men and women realized that intercourse was connected with women giving birth, although it's impossible to say when this was first noticed. So here is this wonderful image of the goddess of Lucelle from the Dordogne area of France. She was found lying horizontally, carved into the rock above a cave entrance there. Notice how her left hand rests on her belly, and her right hand holds a bison's horn in the shape of a crescent moon. It is engraved with 13 lines, making the association between the 13 days of the waxing moon in the heavens and the 13 lunar months of the new life growing in her womb. It's so clear and so wonderfully expressed, so simply expressed, the relationship between the two. Now, the cave was understood to be the womb of the Great Mother from which all life emerged. It was a sort of, on earth, it was the image of the womb. In Western Europe, in the Paleolithic era, when the magnificent paintings we so admire were created, the cave was the most sacred place, the focus of the life of the tribe. Symbolically, it represented the womb of the Great Mother, the secret hidden source of her regenerative power. It was from such mysterious places as the cave and the later megalithic temple tomb and passage grave that she was believed to bring forth the living and receive the souls of the dead back into herself for regeneration and rebirth. The cave may always have been a place where incubation rites were practiced and the shamanic experience of death and rebirth invoked. The cave still symbolizes, in vision and in dream and mystical experience, the deep instinctual psychic level which gives access to revelation and communion with levels of consciousness beyond our normal range. Even now, as one retraces their path into the far recesses of a cave, awed and silenced by the heavy weight of the darkness, one can feel what the people of this ancient time felt. One is inside the womb of the Great Mother, in the utter stillness, the mystery at the very heart of life. In the furthest reach of the cave, in domed chambers, vast as a cathedral, and sometimes in narrow passages as well, people painted and carved the magnificent animals that we can see today. So creation emerged from the cosmic womb of the Great Mother, who was worshipped as the ruler of sky, earth, and the waters beneath the earth. Life was an organic, living, and sacred whole, and all forms of life participated in the web of life that is the Great Mother, the life of the Great Mother. The Milky Way is the passageway by which souls enter and leave this world. So there was a connection with the sky every night. The shamanic journey into the other world was the spiritual experience throughout this era. The most important idea about this time is that there was no creator beyond creation. The creator was creation. There was no separation between the Great Mother as source and the myriad forms of her life. There was no separation, therefore, between spirit and nature, no duality. The Great Mother was both the starry cosmos and all life on earth. The Great Mother ruled the three domains of sky, earth, and underworld, or the waters beneath the earth. The bird was her messenger. The lion was her creative and destructive power and the guardian of her sanctuaries. And the serpent was her power to regenerate life. So if you remember those three, the bird, the lion, and the serpent represented her three domains of earth, of sky, earth, and underworld. So the lunar vision was about the unity of all life. Just as the stars emerged each night from the darkness of the night sky, so the visible universe was born from the dark mystery of the invisible. They always knew that there were two dimensions, the invisible and the visible. Everything was infused with divinity because each and all were part of a living, breathing, connecting web of life, animated by spirit. The hidden dimension of spirit was present in every part of the manifest world. So people lived within a sacred cosmic order of the Great Mother. This was the origin of the idea of kinship with all creation. Now, the mythic theme of lunar culture as a cyclical process of birth, death, and regeneration, always regeneration after death, arose from the age-old observation of the recurring phases of the moon, its birth as the crescent, its waxing to fullness, and its waning into the 3 days of darkness. Over tens of thousands of years, shamanic rituals and myths kept alive the sense of connection between this world and the other invisible world, whose symbol initially may have been the dark phase of the moon. Out of that darkness, the crescent was continually reborn, symbolically associated with the regeneration of the Earth's life, and in India, with cosmic cycles lasting hundreds of thousands of years. The moon was regarded as one of the supreme images of the Great Mother and the later great goddesses, as the unifying power of the mother of all. The moon governed the fecundity of women, the waters of the sea, and the phases of increase and decrease in the life of the crops. It was an enduring image both of renewal in time and of a timeless totality, because what was apparently lost with the waning and dark moon was always restored with the crescent and waxing moon. Duality, imaged as the waxing and waning moon, was contained in the totality of the cycle. So, following this train of thought, life and death were not perceived as opposites, but were seen as phases succeeding each other in a rhythm that was eternal, like the moon. The phases were imagined as a maiden, a mother, and a crone, or daughter, mother, and grandmother. Woman was revered because, like nature, the Great Mother, she was the carrier of new life. The swelling of her womb was associated with the swelling of the crescent moon as it rose to fullness, and woman's gestation period was 10 lunar months of 28 days. Today, when we look up at the night sky, we are connected to the hundreds of generations of people who watched the circumpolar movement of the stars and the changing yet stable course of the moon. Over thousands of years, they observed the connection between the cyclical rhythm of the 4 phases of the moon's life and the rhythm of the 4 seasons of the earth, including its dark and infertile phase in the winter. They experienced the phases of their own lives, youth, maturity, old age, and death, as woven into the rhythm of that greater life, and knew that they would always be regenerated after death. The constant return of the crescent moon after the 3 days of darkness laid the foundation for trust in the survival of the soul and hope in the renewal of life after apparent death. This may have been the original inspiration of the belief in reincarnation, and this lunar pattern spoke to our imagination, giving rise to the myths which endured for thousands of years. We began to perceive birth and death as rites of passage for the soul, as it journeyed back and forth between the visible and invisible dimensions of the Great Mother, a journey that followed a path through the Milky Way and the labyrinth of the stars. The ancestors were not lost to the living, but were close by, available through shamanic mediation to counsel and guide. In lunar culture, therefore, there was no final demarcation line between life and death, or between death and rebirth. Now, the moon was the inspiration of the greatest myths and rituals of the ancient cultures that were focused on the dying and resurrected god or goddess. So in Sumer, we have the famous story of the descent of Inanna, who was a moon goddess. In Babylonia, we have Ishtar's search for Tammuz, her son. In Egypt, we have Isis's search for Osiris, her husband, and her bringing him back to life. In Anatolia and Rome, we have Cybele's search for her son Attis. And in Greece, we have Demeter's search for Persephone. These very ancient and long-lasting lunar myths, sometimes for 2,000 or 3,000 years, celebrated the regeneration of the earth in spring that was associated with the return of the young god or goddess from the underworld. The later Christian myth of Christ's birth, death, and resurrection took the myth of death and regeneration to a new level, signifying the birth of a new era, but it was no longer connected to the cycle of the earth's life as the earlier myths were. All over Europe, particularly in the great cathedrals, the image of the green man appears in ceiling bosses, in choir stalls, and in the carvings at the top of columns. All these images are the work of the master builders of the Middle Ages, many of whom were familiar with alchemy and its secrets. All these images proclaim, I am the secret life of nature. Spirit is present in all you see, touch, and hear. The image of the green man goes back to the dying and resurrected gods of the Bronze Age, who personified the earth's regeneration in spring. The influence of the green man continues into Greek mythology in the figure of Pan, the god of nature, greenness, and regeneration. In the Middle Ages, this image conveys a secret message from the master builders of the cathedrals, the idea that spirit was present in nature. This had to be hidden from the ever-vigilant eyes of the church, for whom this idea was heresy. In the Neolithic era and in the great civilizations of the Bronze Age, particularly those of Egypt, India, and China, the whole cosmos was imagined as a living being, an organic, sacred, and living whole. In India, this vision is present in the marvelous texts of the Vedas and the Upanishads. In China, it is reflected in the philosophy and practice of Taoism, and in the I Ching, or Book of Changes, whose origin in ancient shamanic practices goes back thousands of years. This world was seen as an epiphany, or showing forth of an unseen source or ground, which breathed it into being, animating and sustained it. The breath was very important as an image of connection between everything. Everything was infused with divinity because each and all were part of a living, breathing, connecting web of life, animated by the underlying ground of spirit. So relationship, connection, and unity came to be understood as the essential qualities of the Great Mother and later of the feminine principle. Relationship, connection, and unity, the essential qualities of the feminine principle. Certain features of the landscape were experienced as a portal or ladder that gave access to the invisible world. This inner world could reveal itself in the strange shape of a rock, or the flight of a bird, or the stirring of the leaves of a tree, or the ripples on a lake, or the gushing of a spring from a fissure in a rock, as in this grotto in France, which is accessed by a long spiral path about 5 miles long that goes down into a deep valley. And I've been there. In other words, nature was held to be alive with spirit and able to communicate with man. Everything had meaning. Shamanic wisdom and ways of accessing the invisible dimension were passed orally from teacher to pupil for thousands of years. This was long before there was writing. Shamans and later poets, artists, philosophers, and musicians received their inspiration and their calling from the invisible world. The words spoken, the music heard, the dreams and visions seen came not from inside them, but from the soul of the cosmos, from the spirits of animals, trees, mountains, and rivers, as well as from the ancestors who were never thought of as dead, but who formed a continuous line of connection with the living. At a heightened level of perception, the natural world was almost transparent to that other world, a theophany, or showing forth of it. I think that fairy tales may be the residual fragments of that forgotten participatory experience, where forests were inhabited by creatures who would help or hinder us, where spirits of tree and mountain, stream, and sacred spring could speak to us, where bears or frogs or swans might be demonic beings in disguise, and where old women or old men living deep in the forest might offer us wise counsel, or birds bring us messages, or warning us of dangers, comfort us in bereavement, and act as our guides. The bird as the messenger of the Great Mother is of huge importance from the Paleolithic era onwards. The first image on the left is the earliest known sculpture of the bird form of the Great Mother, probably worn as an amulet. Note the stylized wings and the marks, suggesting a necklace. The beautiful second image, carved from alabaster, comes from the area of the Dardanelles, near Turkey, dated 2200 BCE. The third image, lower left, is from northern Greece, dated to 5000 BCE. And the fourth is Aphrodite, standing on her sacred bird, the goose or swan. So you see the sacredness of the bird was carried through into Greek culture in this way. In literature, the bird became the recognized messenger of the goddess, and we learn that the swallow and the sea eagle were the messengers of Athena in the Odyssey. The last image is of a turtle dove, which was the bird that belonged in all the temples of the goddess, whether in Europe or the Middle East, or India, I think, as well. It became the image of the Holy Spirit in Christianity. The bird as messenger of the invisible world still holds great significance today. I know people who've had a bird such as an owl or a raven coming to warn them of the passing of someone close to them, or have had a bird or birds acting as an escort for the soul as it transitions to the other world. Now I come to an absolutely fascinating part of this story, which is the civilization of Old Europe. And this civilization was discovered by the Lithuanian archaeologist Marija Gimbutas, who is professor emeritus for many years at UCLA. This civilization was dated by her to between 6,500 to 3,500 BCE, or 8,500 to 5,500 years ago. But first, I have to speak about two great cataclysms, which nobody knows about today because you don't learn about them in school or university. There were two major global cataclysms, one dated to 13,800 BCE and the other to 9,600 BCE, that destroyed the island of Atlantis. Its sudden disappearance in a day and a night was recounted by Plato in his Timaeus. Now, following the second cataclysm of the Great Flood, it took people long ages, probably about 5,000 to 6,000 years, to recover from it, before we hear the rise of civilizations in Mesopotamia, India, and China, and Central and South America. However, apart from the people still living close to the caves in southwestern France, there was a remarkable early civilization that arose in Eastern Europe, this civilization of Old Europe, in the area that is now Bulgaria and Romania, close to the Black Sea and the Danube. So I'm going to show you, first of all, a small map of this area. Can you see Bulgaria and Serbia, Romania up above, Moldova, and Hungary on the left, and then the Dardanelles over down at the bottom on the right. I'm going to show you a bigger area, because this was the area where all these archaeological discoveries have been made in the last century, quite astounding ones, some of which I'm going to show you. And so here is a bigger map of the whole of Europe, showing how these peoples moved from this area in Romania and Bulgaria, moved down into Italy, down the coast of Spain on the left, up into Central Europe, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, and a much wider area, so to speak. They came out of this right-hand section of Old Europe. So they spread to Hungary in the north, to Macedonia, Thessaly, Greece, and Crete in the south, and westwards into Italy, reaching Sicily and Malta. The surviving temples on Malta and Gozo are the remnants of this civilization. From the shape of the many temples and sculptures found there, it is clear that the early Maltese people, like those of the river and lake settlements further north, worshipped the great goddess. The Etruscans in Italy may have been the last descendants of that forgotten civilization. These people created the most marvelous, highly decorated pottery. A few years ago, I saw an exhibition that was called The Lost World of Old Europe in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and I was stunned by the size and magnificence of the pottery vases I saw there. I suspect that many of them were made by women and decorated by women. So this Neolithic civilization was matrilineal, agricultural, and peaceful. People lived in harmony with nature and worshipped the great goddess. There is no evidence of conflict and territorial aggression or of defensive hill fortifications and lethal weapons. There are no burials of men with weapons. It was a highly creative and artistic civilization that left a strong cultural legacy in Southern Europe that we can still see traces of today, particularly in Crete and southern Italy. Gimbutas realized that the many different goddess images that she found represented the three dimensions of the Great Mother: the sky dimension, bringing her life-giving sun and rain; the earth dimension, giving her life-giving crops; and the waters welling up from beneath the earth, ensuring the survival of animals, crops, and people. In her book, The Language of the Goddess, she wrote, "The goddess in all her manifestations was a symbol of the unity of all life in nature. Her power was in water and stone, in cave and tomb, in animals and birds, in hills, trees, and flowers. She was perceived as the personification of all that was sacred and mysterious on earth, and her three main functions were life-giving, death-wielding, and regenerative." Now I come to the images. Now here are two of the most remarkable images of the Great Mother from the area of the Danube Valley. The labyrinth and the spiral were at this early time symbols of the connecting pathway between this world and the cosmic dimension of the Great Mother's womb. If you look at the right-hand figure, you will see traces of the bird-shaped head of the older images. You see how similar they are. They're tiny, very, very small. I should have put the dimensions in, really. Now here is a fascinating circle of enthroned female figures. Were they priestesses presiding over some ancient rituals, or a council of women? And who made them, women or men? I suspect it was women, because they're so clearly shaped by woman's experience. And here is a circle of male and female figures, all beautifully decorated. They're very small, maybe about 6 inches, 7 inches high. But it's amazing that they've survived all this time, 4,200 BC. That's 6,200 years. It's staggering, really. And here is one of those figures decorated for the front and the back. And this skill goes through to Greece much later on. The same sort of swirling patterns of whirls and walls on the body were taken into the Greek culture as well. Just note the dates of those. And here we have two magnificent pottery vessels, which are huge. About sort of one on the right is about 2 feet tall, and the one on the left about the same. And amazing that they were able to be, obviously they were in fragments when they were found, but they would be able to be put together again. These hugely creative people lived in large straw-roofed rectangular houses. They had the leisure to create these large and very beautifully decorated pottery, like these two vessels, as well as fascinating implements for everyday use. Then abruptly, their civilization vanished, leaving only these wonderful traces of it to be discovered in the last century in Romania. And here we have the bird goddess again from the Dardanelles, and on the right, the goddess of death and regeneration that was found in many tombs, which is from the Cycladic culture of Greece. And we have these, this goddess with animals. Can you see her in the middle of the vase? And the swastika-like image was an image of the moon, because of the 4 phases of the moon. The swastika was a symbol of the moon. And here are 2 extraordinary modern, almost Henry Moorish figures from Romania, dating to 7,000 years ago. Just amazing. Again, they're from Romania. Now, the peaceful agricultural civilization of old Europe was brought to an end by 3 successive incursions of patriarchal Kurgan tribes from 4,400 BC to 3,000 BC. And these came down from the Russian steppes in the corridor between the Black and Caspian Seas, if you can imagine that space, bringing with them the horse and the weapons and the war chariot. And Europe was never the same again. These tribal invasions of people who were later named Indo-Europeans moved southwards into Europe and eastwards into Persia, India, and Afghanistan. In India, they drove the indigenous Dravidian people down to the south and imposed the rigid caste system, which disastrously still controls India today, taking a horrific toll in the rape and murder of women in the lowest caste there. Gimbutas spoke of these Kurgan or Indo-European people as introducing a new cultural group into Europe, one that was patriarchal, patrilineal, and warlike. Before their arrival, the people of old Europe buried their dead in communal graves, with grave offerings indicating no great difference in wealth or status, and no supremacy of one gender over the other. There was no hierarchy of priests or rulers. She argued that the Kurgan people introduced Indo-European languages into the lands they conquered, as well as new cultural systems based on the domination of warriors and kings over the general populace, and the domination of men over women. She concluded there was no evidence of war for over 3,000 years in the civilization of old Europe, which laid the foundation for the later Etruscan, Cretan, and early Greek civilizations. It could be acknowledged as the early foundation of Western civilization. It is a gross misunderstanding, she wrote, to imagine warfare as endemic to the human condition. This contradicts the scholarship of many people today who say that there's always been war. This is not true, and this is the evidence that she brought to prove it. Widespread fights and fortification buildings have indeed been the way of life for most of our direct ancestors, from the Bronze Age up until now. However, this was not the case in the Paleolithic and Neolithic. There are no depictions of arms in the Paleolithic cave paintings, nor are there remains of weapons used by man against man during the Neolithic of old Europe. That's old Europe that she's talking about. From some 150 paintings that survive from Çatalhöyük, that's in Turkey, there is not one depicting a scene of conflict or fighting, or of war or torture. Çatalhöyük was built at roughly the same time as the old European pottery that we have. In the language of the goddess, she wrote, the goddess in all her manifestations was the symbol of the unity of all life in nature. Hence the holistic and mythopoetic perception of the sacredness and mystery of all there is on earth. And to end her book, she wrote this: the clash between these two ideologies and economic structures led to the drastic transformation of old Europe. These changes were expressed as the transition from the matrilineal to a patrilineal social order, from a sexually balanced society to a male-dominated hierarchy, and from a goddess religion to the Indo-European sky-oriented pantheon of gods. Now, Gimbutas had a terrible time with other archaeologists who attacked her on every front, said she was just talking nonsense, and her hypothesis, her Kurgan hypothesis of these descent of these warrior people from the Russian steppes was contemptuously rebutted by mainstream archaeologists until 2018, only 3 years ago, when Lord Colin Renfrew, who was a famous archaeologist, concluded the inaugural Mariha Gimbutas lecture at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago with these words: Mariha's Kurgan hypothesis has been magnificently vindicated. And with this statement, he implicitly gave permission to other scholars to reconsider all of Gimbutas's theories and perhaps eventually to restore her to her rightful place as one of the most, if not the most, creative, scientific, groundbreaking archaeologists of the 20th century. The crucial evidence which shifted the ground was the discovery of the difference in the DNA between the peaceful people of old Europe and the warlike Kurgan tribes descending from the Russian steppes. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And poor Marie had died of cancer, and I'm sure that it was caused and increased really by her suffering under all these wretched archaeologists who had attacked her. So now I come to some buildings for you, and this is the Gigantia temple on Gozo, which is colossal. I've been there, and the walls are just incredible. Look at the huge stones in the bottom picture. I don't know how they put them in place. And Malta is covered with temples, and there are more under the sea, which were the result of subsidence, probably during the Atlantean time. Malta and Gozo have some of the oldest surviving Neolithic temples dating to 3000 BCE, whose ground plan follows the contours of a womb or the shape of the Great Mother or Great Goddess. Some temples have been discovered submerged beneath the coastal waters, suggesting that Malta was once much bigger than it is today. And as I said, the stones used to build these temples were huge. And in one of the underground temples called the Hypogean or the Hypogeum, goes down and down and down and down, several layers, and really going down, like going down in a lift, but you go down a winding staircase. And in the area of this winding staircase, there was found this tiny little priestess figure, probably lying in an incubation state or having a dream. We don't know. She's only tiny. She's only about 6 inches long. So she may have been a priestess, or she may have been a woman dreaming of giving birth later on. We don't know. Now, the Neolithic was a time when shamanic cultures flourished, guided by highly skilled astronomers, engineers, and architects, who raised the great stone temples that we can still see today, and who later were known as the Druids. In Europe, we have the long avenues of raised stones at Carnac in Brittany. We have Stonehenge and a huge stone circle at Avebury. Ireland is full of remnants of a culture that worshipped the goddess and buried the dead in stone passage graves. And around 3200 BCE, or 5,200 years ago, this huge gleaming temple at Newgrange was built. In the moonlight, it must have gleamed white because it wouldn't have had grass on it. But the grass covers it today. It's one of the most spectacular temples that exist in Europe, or really all over the world. And in the front of one of the entranceways is the triple spiral, a huge stone with the triple spiral of the goddess on it. The triple spiral represented the 3 domains of sky, earth, and underworld. And here, that shaft you just saw above the stone allowed the sun to come in, the first rays of the sun at the winter solstice. It entered at dawn at the winter solstice and streamed down a long, narrow passage which lit up a stone at its far end. This magical dawn ritual signified the union of the sun with the earth and the renewal of the earth's fertility. You can see how close they were to the earth and to the sky, that how everything was related, everything kind of was a great story at that time. I hope I've made it clear that during the lunar era, we were aware of 2 dimensions of experience, this earthly one and another invisible one, to which we were connected as by an umbilical cord. Myths and rituals came into being in order to create a sacred space where the connection with the eternal would be kept alive and honored through rituals, storytelling, and the cultivation of the mythic imagination. All these connections and associations came into being through the ability of people to observe, to listen, and make connections between what they saw and what they intuitively felt and understood. All this was later repressed by Christianity as animism, and later still contemptuously dismissed by the so-called rational mind as superstition. Just to think of it makes me furiously angry. And here is a wonderful Cretan goddess, I think, or priestess, we don't quite know which, holding the snakes, symbol of the underworld, and with a tiny leopard on her head. And on the right is a Cretan priestess wearing the great knot that she wore knotted at the back of her shoulders, which was a symbol of her calling. See how beautiful her skirt was on the left, the tiered flounced layers of it, which all the women of that time wore. And they were bare-breasted as well. They weren't afraid of showing their breasts. It didn't make them feel guilty to do so. And here, I'm skipping around a bit between cultures. Here's Athena, and showing with the serpent on the edge of her robe and also around the headdress. There's a circle of serpents on her head. So that was one of the primary images associated with her. This is from the oldest temple on the Acropolis. In the Odyssey, Athena appears to Odysseus as the sea eagle and the swallow. So there you have carried forth from the Neolithic the older images of the bird associated with the goddess. And here we have the goddess Hera associated with lions on either side of her. So they were the guardians of her sanctuaries. And here from Anatolia or modern Turkey, we have this extraordinary goddess, not very tall, maybe about 8 inches tall. She's giving birth and she's seated on a lion or leopard throne, flanked by the two animals. And on the right, from Madrid, of all places, is Cybele in a chariot, because she was also a Roman goddess, and this is a Roman image. Cybele in a chariot, drawn by the same lions that were probably with her in the earlier image. So you can see the continuity over that earlier image is probably 6000 BC, whereas the one on the right is probably about 200 AD. Now we come to the greatest image, I think, that I've ever seen of the goddess. It's huge, and it's in the museum in Naples. It's about 8 feet tall, and it's just been restored, really. You can see that the black head, hands, and feet represent the dark phase of the moon, and she is a moon goddess. She's got the great lunar crescent on her breast, and she's got the breasts hanging below it, which is a symbol of her fertility, her gift of fertility. And all over her body are symbols of animals, bees, and also angels, and a priestesses of her cult above the crescent on her neck. Artemis was one of the most important and widely worshipped great goddesses of the ancient world. Only Isis was equal to her in stature and importance, and the worship of both goddesses lasted far into the Roman era and spread as far as Marseille in France. As part of the Greek Empire, the main center of her cult was Ephesus, on the western coast of modern Turkey, but she was worshipped over the whole of Anatolia, that is modern Turkey, as Cybele. A statue similar to this one stood at the far end of her magnificent temple of Ephesus, which I'll show you in a minute, and resting on her many breasts is a great lunar crescent, identifying her as a moon goddess. Beneath it is a circle of tiny acorns, and on her body are sculpted many different animals, including lions, bulls, stags, and bees, as well as plants, angelic beings, and priestesses of her temple. Her breasts signify boundless nourishment, for she was worshipped as the nourisher of all life. Her black face, hands, and feet point to the dark phase of the moon. Other sculptures of Artemis show her with the signs of the zodiac, showing her dimensions as a universal or cosmic goddess. And this great temple to Artemis dates to the 6th century BC. It was destroyed, I think, around 400 BC, but built again. It was named as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was 3 times larger than the Parthenon in Athens. I don't know if you've seen the Parthenon, but if you can imagine the colossal size of it. It has 127 fluted Ionic columns which rose 60 feet into the air and were crowned with brightly painted capitals decorated with rosettes. The great columns were carved with mythological scenes, and the lintel, the triangular lintel, was so heavy that the architect nearly committed suicide the night before it was erected. But miraculously, the goddess raised the lintel overnight, and it was in its destined position by morning. He must have breathed a great sigh of relief. It was destroyed by fire in 356 BC, and another built in its place. In Roman times, when St. Paul arrived in Ephesus to speak about the new order of Christianity, he was howled down by the worshippers of the goddess, who cried out in the great amphitheater there, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," and we're not going to put up with this new god. So here is an image of Demeter with Persephone, her daughter. Demeter was the great goddess of the fertility of the earth, whose temple at Eleusis lasted for 3,000 years until it was destroyed on the orders of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. The secret rites of Eleusis that the Greek philosophers took part in must have given them a sense of trust in the survival of the soul and the reunion with their loved ones after death. Rituals like those at the great temple at Eleusis in Greece strengthened the sense of participation in an unseen reality and gave initiates an experience of the immortality of the soul. In a culture where visionary experience was validated, people encountered goddesses and gods in their dreams and visions. Birds were recognized as messengers of the invisible, very possibly because people dreamed about them in this role, or even heard them as a voice speaking inside them. Birds in later cultures are transformed into angels, but in countless paintings of the Christian era, we still have the image of the dove, messenger of the Holy Spirit. Intuitive sensibility and the ability to communicate with the spirits of plants taught people to gather, grind, or distill certain herbs and plants for healing illness or for hallucinogenic experience. Rites of incubation and healing were practiced in many sanctuaries. We know from the temples of the god Asclepius in Greece that dreams and visions were of great importance in the diagnosis and healing of disease. Everything was connected, everything was sacred. The shaman healers who guided these cultures were trained to enter a state of utter stillness and to listen and observe what they heard and saw in an altered state of consciousness. The Greek philosopher Parmenides, living in southern Italy in the 5th century BC, describes his shamanic journey into the underworld, driving in a chariot drawn by mares and steered by young women through great gates that opened onto oiled hinges into what the Greeks called the immortal realm. There, the goddess Persephone took his right hand in hers, telling him to transmit her teaching to the world of mortals. The purpose of these journeys was to receive from the goddess the laws that were to guide the human community. Parmenides was the teacher of Plato and had a great influence on his contemporaries. A long line of shaman teachers and healers whose names are recorded on stone in the town of Velia, south of Naples, where he lived, is now known to have descended from him for some 500 years. They thought it was so important that they carved the names of all these healers onto this piece of stone. So this shamanic view of reality and the practice of incubation, where they spent maybe 3 nights in a cave or dark place, was most highly developed in Egypt and Western Anatolia, from whence it was transmitted to the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers and to Crete. Now I'm returning to Egypt for a few moments. There were 4 Egyptian great goddesses who carry forward the image of the earlier Great Mother and the feeling that everything was ensouled with divine presence. Among these goddesses was Maat, who wore on her head the ostrich feather against which each human heart was weighed after death, balanced in the scales of justice. Because Egyptian mythology had a great influence on neighboring cultures, Mart may be the origin of the figure of divine wisdom in the Old Testament, for she personified the equilibrium and harmony of the cosmos, intrinsic to all life forms, even to the notes on the musical scale. In all the temples of the great goddess in the Middle East and in Egypt and in Greece, there was always a sacred tree, usually a sycamore because of its milky sap, but also an olive. We find it in Sumerian, Babylonian, and Assyrian mythology, and eventually in the Book of Genesis. But its most beautiful expression is from Egypt. Luminous, nurturing, awesome, the voice of the divine feminine speaks from the heart of Egyptian culture, bringing through from the Neolithic the image of life as a divine unity. It was, above all, the great goddesses of Egypt who transmit this feeling of the unity of life. They were the tree of life, the date palm and the sycamore tree with its milky sap, and were often shown offering from the tree's leafy interior the vases that contained the water of eternal life and provided nourishment for the souls passing from one dimension to the other. The image of the tree of life passes from the temples of Bronze Age Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan to the myth of the fall in the Book of Genesis, where it stood in the Garden of Eden, and later it reappears in the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah. Egypt has bequeathed to us one of the clearest images of this ancient worldview, as well as the incomparable knowledge of astronomy, geometry, mathematics, and engineering skills that supported it, and that they transmitted to the Greeks, and from there to the Persians. The mythological imagery associated with two great goddesses, Hathor and Isis, is of paramount importance for understanding the cosmos as a living maternal entity. These goddesses were interchangeable with each other. Both were imagined as the nurturing mother of the universe and as the creative life impulse which flowed from the cosmic immensity of their being. It was they who endowed Pharaoh with the divine fiery power to rule Egypt, represented by the uraeus or cobra that both wore on their headdress. You can see it there on Hathor's headdress, and Pharaoh would have worn it as well on his headdress. More specifically, Hathor was imagined as the Milky Way, whose milk nourished all life. Yet she was also immanent within the forms of life, immanent in the statues that stood in her temples and in the beautiful blue lotus that was daily laid at her feet. As Divine Mother, Hathor received the souls of the dead at the entrance to her sacred mountain, thought to be located behind the magnificent mortuary temple of Der el-Bahri that Queen Hatshepsut built to honor and house the goddess. Goddesses and gods were at that time believed to inhabit their temples. The Milky Way itself, in Egyptian as well as in many other ancient cultures, was looked upon not only as the great stellar causeway that souls took as they entered and left this world, but also as the great mother, source of all. This is why in Egypt and Mesopotamia, as well as India, the goddess was worshipped as a cow whose milk nourished all life. Now in Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess, we have the personification of the dark aspect of the goddess, Hathor, who could bring famine, drought, and pestilence, yet who also had the power to heal these and to banish drought and disease. She can be compared with Kali in India. And here we have the goddess Isis with Pharaoh. You can see both of them with the uraeus on their foreheads, on their headdress. This beautiful picture reflects the very close relationship between the goddess and Pharaoh. Here I must mention the ritual of the sacred marriage, which was the most important event of the year, both in Egypt and Mesopotamia. This marriage was celebrated in the magnificent temples along the Nile and brought together the priestess of the goddess and the Pharaoh in a ritual of sexual union enacted in the temple. The same ritual of the sacred marriage and sexual union was enacted in Sumer in Mesopotamia. So you can see how important sexuality was at this time. It was considered an absolutely sacred thing of the relationship between man and woman, and particularly between the god and goddess, or goddess and pharaoh. Here we have Isis and her son Horus. And the great Egyptologist Wallace Budge wrote in his Gods of the Egyptians that Isis was a great and beneficent goddess and mother whose influence and love pervaded all heaven and earth and the abode of the dead. And she was the personification of the great feminine creative power which conceived and brought forth every living creature and thing, from the gods in heaven to man on earth and to the insect on the ground. What she brought forth she protected and cared for, and fed and nourished, and she employed her life in using her power graciously and successfully, not only in creating new beings, but in restoring those that were dead. Listen to this description of a vision of the goddess Isis, recorded in a book called The Golden Ass, written by Apuleius, a North African man living in Rome in the 2nd century CE, who was an initiate of the mysteries of Isis. The apparition of a woman began to rise from the middle of the sea, with so lovely a face that the gods themselves would have fallen down in adoration of it. First the head, then the whole shining body gradually emerged and stood before me, poised on the surface of the waves. Her long, thick hair fell in tapering ringlets on her lively neck, and was crowned with an intricate chaplet, in which was woven every kind of flower. Just above her brow shone a round gold disc, like a mirror, or like the bright face of the moon, which told me who she was. Vipers rising from the left hand and right hand partings of her hair supported this disc, with ears of corn bristling beside them. Her many-colored robe was of the finest linen. Part was glistening white, part crocus yellow, part glowing red, and all along the entire hem a woven bordure of flowers and fruit clung swaying in the breeze. But what caught and held my eye more than anything else was the deep black luster of her mantle. She wore it slung across her body from the right hip to the left shoulder, where it was caught in a knot, resembling the boss of a shield. But part of it hung in innumerable folds, the tasseled fringe quivering. It was embroidered with glittering stars on the hem, and everywhere else, and in the middle beamed a full and fiery moon. On her divine feet were slippers of palm leaves, the emblem of victory. And these are the words that she spoke to him. You see me here, Lucius, in answer to your prayer. I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all the elements, primordial child of time, sovereign of all things spiritual, queen of the dead, queen also of the immortals, the single manifestation of all gods and goddesses that are. My nod governs the starry heights of heaven, the wholesome sea breezes, the lamentable silences of the world below. Though I am worshipped in many aspects known by countless names and propitiated with all manner of different rites, yet the whole round earth venerates me. Some of the most beautiful hymns and prayers that have come down to us from Egypt were addressed to the goddess Nut as mother of the souls of the dead, as the mysterious deep ground of life and the soul. Nut was the starry vault of heaven, whose vast cosmic body was home to all the stars. Each night the god died into her body on his nightly descent into the underworld, and was reborn from her at the dawn of a new day. Nut's image was painted on the inside of coffin lids, and sometimes on the base as well, as if to enfold the soul entrusted to her care in her cosmic embrace. There is a beautiful and moving inscription to her on a fragment of stone that I found long ago in the Louvre. I will read it to you because it evokes her presence, and you can hear the legacy of the earlier great mother. O my mother Nut, Stretch your wings over me. Let me become like the imperishable stars, like the indefatigable stars. O great being who is in the world of the dead, at whose feet is eternity, in whose hand is the always. O great divine beloved soul who is in the mysterious abyss, come to me. Jeremy Nadler, who has made a profound study of early Egyptian culture, tells us in his book, The Future of the Ancient World, Essays on the History of Consciousness, that in Egypt, people still saw the visible world as permeable to the invisible ground which illuminated it with a divine radiance. This is what he wrote. The gods were still present in the land of Egypt, for nature was still transparent, not yet solid and opaque. Nature mediated divine energies that people became aware of by seeing through the phenomenal world to the numinous presences beyond. The Egyptians were wise about the invisible worlds that interpenetrate the physical, for they perceived the powers that move behind the facade of sense existence. Above all, they understood that the real world is not solid, and that if one is seeking spiritual foundations for one's life, then it is necessary to develop a consciousness that is able to travel through the literal world to the symbolic world, to the world of the sacred imagination. We have followed the transformation of the Great Mother of the Neolithic era into the great goddesses of the Bronze Age and further into Greek times. These great goddesses were worshipped as the source of life, one life manifesting as the life of each and all. Sexuality was seen as the vital expression of that life, a sacred, ecstatic experience associated with life's own creative impulse, eternally to renew itself. And women were priestesses in all the temples of the goddess, without exception. So, to sum up the essence of this long lunar era, I have to show you these 6 extraordinary men who were the pre-Socratic philosophers. Thales of Miletus on the west coast of Turkey, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Parmenides, who I mentioned before, Anaxagoras, and Empedocles. They were all shamans, and they were all in touch with the inner world or the invisible world, and they all brought forth their knowledge and their wisdom from that world. If we listen to the pre-Socratic philosophers of the 6th century BC, we find that they carry forward the legacy of the participatory experience of the Great Mother. Heraclitus suggests that the soul is of unfathomable depth. Thales of Miletus speaks of the all as being alive and full of daemons, who are the agents of the one soul substance. Anaxagoras says that humanity and nature are fundamentally inseparable because both participate in the same underlying substance that he calls soul. This concept is now returning with a new story in science, which I will speak of in my last talk. Pythagoras spent 40 years with the astronomers priest in Egypt and Babylon before he defined the mathematical laws which embodied the intelligence, wisdom, and mathematical harmony of the cosmos, laws which eventually reached the builders of Chartres. He left these words to encourage us: take heart, for the human race is divine. Parmenides carried forward the ancient practice of incubation that enabled its practitioners to reach the inner dimension of the cosmos. And he said, were sacred beings having a human experience or having a planetary experience. I always like that expression. Finally, we have Plato in the 5th century BCE in his Timaeus, who was the first to give a name to the image of an all-embracing cosmic entity, which he describes as a single living creature that encompasses all the living creatures that are within it. He called it psyche tou kosmou, or the soul of the cosmos. And that's why I called my book The Dream of the Cosmos, because I was speaking of this cosmic soul in it. So the priceless gift of the pre-Socratic philosophers to us is the understanding that the cosmos has an inner life, a soul, and that this cosmic soul is the origin or ground of our own individual soul, our own consciousness. So moving to the end now, we carry within our psyche a very ancient kind of consciousness or experience of life that I have named lunar consciousness, and associate with the timeless wisdom of the soul. It is an instinctive, participatory, holistic, relational way of knowing, mediated through instinct, sensory observation, intuition, and feeling, or the heart. And it's still found in shamanic cultures today. We need to reconnect with this consciousness and to listen to what Jung called the spirit of the depths. Remember that phrase, the spirit of the depths. It's very important. Once, long ago, the world was experienced as alive with spirit, and nature was part of a sacred cosmic whole. We ourselves were part of that divinity, although we have lost all knowledge of this. Everything that the image of the Great Mother once embraced in earlier cultures was lost, and with it the vital sense of participation in the cosmic life of an invisible entity, imagined as a containing, connecting, and benevolent maternal being. So what happened to make us lose this vital sense of participation? I hope to answer that question tomorrow when we come to look at the solar era. Thank you.